Jason, she whispered, her voice shaky. Why are we back here? We drove past this traffic light a few minutes ago. You just drove in a circle. What are you talking about? I would know if we've been here before. Sit tight, we're almost home. Two days later, as she was settling into work, a delivery arrived at her desk. It was a bouquet of beautiful red roses. A small note accompanied it. I'd like to make it up to you. Vivian's stomach churned. She crumpled the note in her hand and tossed it into the trash. Over the next few days, more flowers came. Roses, lilies, even orchids, each with carefully worded compliments. Notes like, "You looked stunning in that blue dress this morning," or "I like the way you styled your hair today. It suits your pretty face." They were detailed, too detailed. Almost as if he'd been watching her closely. At lunch one day, her colleague and friend Jessica caught sight of the latest bouquet and raised an eyebrow. "Okay, spill. Who's sending you all these flowers? Are you secretly dating someone?" Vivian sighed, running a hand through her hair. "It's Jason. Jason from your building. I thought you two were done with whatever that was." "We are. Or we were," Vivian replied, hesitating. "He's been acting weird." "Weird? What do you mean?" Jessica asked, raising an eyebrow. Vivian shook her head, her expression clouded with confusion. "I don't know. Something just feels off. It's like he's two different people. One moment, he's all sweet and attentive, and the next, he's distant and cold. Just the other day, after what seemed like a perfect night together, he practically pushed me out of his house. Then later, he texts me, asking if I'd fix my leaking roof and offers to help, like nothing happened." Jessica smirked, shrugging it off. "He's probably just going through something. I mean, flowers aren't the worst thing a guy can send. If anything, he seems like he's trying, right? Maybe cut him some slack. Hear him out. See what happens. Maybe he's just distracted." "Maybe," Vivian muttered, unconvinced, on her way home that evening. Her thoughts were still spinning around Jason and his bizarre behavior. The Uber driver turned on the radio, and the voice of a news anchor filled the car. "Breaking news tonight. The CEO of Wishful Pharmaceuticals was shot and killed at close range. Witnesses say a masked man fled the scene after stealing a briefcase from the wrecked vehicle. Authorities are investigating the incident, but details remain unclear." Vivian stared at the radio in disbelief. Not sure she was in the mood for any bad news. She shook her head, asking the Uber driver to switch to music instead, desperate to clear her mind. But even as the soft tunes filled the car, Jason's strange behavior lingered in her thoughts. When the Uber pulled up to her apartment complex, she stepped out and immediately noticed Jason's car pulling into the lot. Her heart raced. He got out, wearing a hat pulled low over his face, carrying a briefcase in hand. She smiled, raising her hand to wave. But Jason didn't smile back. In fact, he didn't even look at her. His face was tight, eyes hollow, as if he didn't recognize her at all. He brushed past her without a word. "Jason!" she called, her voice small. No response. He vanished into the building, leaving her standing there, clutching the flowers he'd sent that morning, her heart pounding in her chest. What the hell had just happened? As she walked to her apartment, the flowers in her hand suddenly felt heavy, as if they were mocking her for ever believing things could be normal. That night, her phone buzzed with a text. Did you love the flowers? Vivian's skin prickled with unease. Was this some kind of joke? He had walked right past her hours earlier, completely ignoring her, and now he was texting her like nothing had happened. She stared at the message, her heart racing. She wanted to scream. She wanted answers. But most of all, she wanted this to stop. 2 days later, another delivery came. This time, it wasn't flowers. It was a box of chocolates and a small jewelry set, along with a note. Red looks incredible on you. I'm jealous of that dress. It hugs you so perfectly. Her mind spun. She dialed his number, desperate for an explanation. But there was no answer. She texted him, begging him to stop sending gifts. No response. For a week, there was silence. No flowers, no messages. Not even the loud music that usually thumped through his apartment walls. His door had packages piled up outside, untouched. Then, 2 weeks later, it started again. A bar of chocolate and another note, this one complimenting her shoes. That night, the music was back, blaring through the walls. Fed up, Vivian marched to his door and pounded on it. When he answered, she shoved the gifts into his hands. I told you to stop sending me flowers, and now you're sending chocolates. She snapped, her voice quivering with frustration. Jason stared at her blankly, his eyes cold, emotionless. What are you talking about? Lady, I don't even know you. He barked at her. Very funny, Jason. The flowers, the chocolates. You've been sending them to me for weeks. I need you to stop, she said, her voice rising. I didn't send you anything, he said flatly, his tone darkening. His gaze bore into her, unblinking. Vivian's heart raced. What do you mean, you didn't send them? You've been leaving me notes, Jason. You've been... Before she could finish, he cut her off, his face twisting with irritation. You're crazy, he spat. Now get lost. She opened her mouth to argue, but before she could get another word out, he slammed the door in her face. With her heart pounding, she kicked the door hard with the heel of her boot. The sharp thud reverberated through the hallway, but it wasn't enough to quell her fury. Her eyes darted to the chocolates, and the jewelry set still clutched in her hand. Without thinking, she flung them against the door with all the strength she could muster. The box of chocolates exploded against the wood, pieces flying everywhere, and the jewelry clattered to the floor in a scattered mess. Vivian stormed back to her apartment, slamming the door behind her. Her mind was racing. She threw open her closet and yanked a small overnight bag from the shelf. Jessica, her best friend, had always offered her a place to stay when things got tough, and right now that offer felt like her only lifeline. She tossed a few clothes into the bag, her movements frantic, hands shaking. She needed space, time to think. The more she tried to make sense of it, the angrier she became. Why was she even dealing with this? With her bag packed, she opened the door, ready to leave Jason and his erratic behavior behind. But the second the door opened, her blood ran cold. Jason was standing right in front of her. Jason, she whispered. Fear creeping into her voice, her grip tightening around the strap of her bag. What are you doing here? He didn't answer. For a moment, they just stared at each other. His expression was cold, almost blank. He was too close, his presence too strong, filling the doorway. She stepped back as he walked towards her. Jason, she whispered, gripping the strap of her bag tighter. What are you doing here? He didn't answer. His face was expressionless, his eyes distant, like he wasn't really there. He stepped forward, his fists clenching at his sides. "Jason, I'm leaving. Please just move." Her voice trembled as she tried to keep calm, but he didn't move. His eyes were empty, like a stranger's. Then, without warning, he lunged at her. His hands were suddenly around her throat, squeezing hard. She gasped, her back slamming against the wall, the force knocking the wind out of her. Panic flooded her as she clawed at his wrists, trying to break free, but his grip was like steel. Her vision blurred, and the air left her lungs as his hands tightened. "Jason, stop!" she choked, her voice barely a whisper. But his face remained blank. She kicked at him, but her strength was fading fast. This wasn't Jason, not the Jason she knew. His eyes, once familiar, were cold and lifeless. Just when she thought she'd pass out, Jason's hands suddenly loosened, and he staggered back, clutching his head. He let out a guttural scream, stumbling into the wall. "Get out of my head!" he yelled, his voice filled with pain. His body convulsed, shaking violently. Vivian collapsed to the floor, gasping for air. Her hands went to her neck, feeling the tender skin where his fingers had been. Her vision cleared, and she looked up to see Jason writhing on the floor, his face twisted in agony. "Get out of my head!" he screamed again, pounding his fists on the floor as if something was tearing at his mind. Vivian was frozen in shock. She had never seen anyone like this. Jason's entire body shook as though he was in the middle of a violent seizure, his screams filling the hallway. She couldn't stay. She had to get out. In a panic, she scrambled to her feet, grabbed her bag, and bolted. Jason's screams followed her as she ran down the hallway, her heart thudding in her chest. She didn't stop until she reached the stairwell, her breath coming in ragged gasps. When she finally reached the street, she glanced back at the building, but she couldn't bring herself to go back. Not now, not ever. After that terrifying night, Vivian called her friend Jessica, crying as she explained everything that had happened. Jessica insisted they go straight to the police. Sitting in the sterile, cold police station, Vivian recounted the events of the night to an officer. Every moment, Jason's sudden attack, his incoherent words, and the violent seizure that followed. She described everything in detail with her hands trembling. The officer listened carefully, and by the end of her statement, Jason was arrested and released on bail. After 2 days, but issued a restraining order, and Vivian was advised to stay away from him at all costs. She took that advice to heart. Taking time off work, she packed a small bag and went to stay with her family for a while, far away from the memories of her old life and the shadow Jason had cast over it. She needed to heal, to feel safe again. It wasn't easy as she had non-stop nightmares, flashes of Jason's hands around her throat, haunting her when she closed her eyes. But her family helped, and so did Jessica. They supported her, reminding her that she was strong, that she had survived. After a month, Vivian felt ready to start over. She didn't want to go back to the apartment she had shared with Jason. That place was filled with too many bad memories. She found a new place, closer to her office, and moved out quietly, leaving that chapter of her life behind. Life slowly began to return to normal. She focused on her work, spending her free time with friends and family, trying to find joy in the little things again. It was during this time that she met Michael. Michael was nothing like Jason. Where Jason had been intense and unpredictable, Michael was warm, gentle, and steady. They met by chance at a local cafe. Vivian had been waiting in line for her coffee when she accidentally bumped into him, spilling his drink. "I'm so sorry," she had said, mortified Michael had just laughed. brushing it off like it was nothing. "It's just coffee," he'd said with a smile. "But you can make it up to me by letting me buy you one." That's how it started. A simple coffee date that turned into several more. Michael was easy to talk to, and for the first time in a long time, Vivian found herself laughing again, relaxing in someone else's company. He was a breath of fresh air, and slowly, Vivian began to feel like she could trust someone again. One evening, after a few months of dating, Michael picked her up for a dinner date. Vivian stood in front of her mirror, her hair softly curled. She smiled at her reflection, feeling more like herself than she had in a long time. As she stepped outside, she spotted Michael waiting by his car, leaning against the door with a grin. He opened the car door for her and planted a soft kiss on her cheek. "You look amazing," he whispered, his hand resting gently on the small of her back. Vivian smiled, feeling warmth spread through her. This was different. Michael was different, and she liked it. That night, as they sat in a cozy corner of the restaurant, Michael's laughter blended with hers over the soft clink of wine glasses. For the first time in what felt like forever, Vivian felt a spark of peace, a glimpse of normalcy. Maybe, just maybe, life could feel right again. But as she glanced toward the window, she gasped. Was that Jason? Standing outside, his eyes locked on her, dark and empty like before. The chill that ran down her spine was unmistakable, her body tensing as memories of the night he strangled her flooded her mind. The fear, the look in his eyes, the way he had almost... She blinked and the figure was gone. Michael, sensing the shift in her, frowned with concern. "Vivian, what's wrong?" She shook her head, heart racing. I thought I saw him. Jason outside." Michael turned his gaze toward the window, then back at her, his expression softening. "It's probably just your mind playing tricks. You've been through a lot. But I'm here, okay? No one's going to hurt you." His hand gripped hers, warm and steady. They finished dinner, and Michael drove her home. When they stood in front of her apartment, bathed by the soft glow of the streetlights, Michael leaned in and kissed her softly, his lips warm against hers. As she opened her door and stepped inside, she gave him one last smile before closing it. But as the lock clicked into place, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. That night, after getting ready for bed, she noticed something strange on her kitchen table. A single, blood-red rose sat in the center of the table, along with a note. Vivian's heart stopped. She hadn't bought a rose. With trembling fingers, she picked up the note. The handwriting was familiar. "I never really left, Vivian. I don't want to hurt you, but I'm afraid I won't be able to stop myself." She froze. The air was thick with the scent of lavender and fear. The note slipped from her hands as she backed away. How had Jason found her? How had he gotten into her new apartment? She reached for her phone, dialing Jessica's number. Jessica had insisted she stay put, promising to come over with the police. As the minutes passed, anxiety swelled within her, her heart almost popping out of her chest. She tried to focus on anything else, but exhaustion from the fear and tension took over, and soon enough, she dozed off on the couch. A loud noise woke her up. Minutes later, her heart leapt in her chest. The sound of footsteps echoed through her apartment as she tried to make sense of what was happening. Immediately, that figure she spotted in the corner prompted her to sit up, fear bathing her entire body. Standing in the dim light, silhouetted against the door, was Jason. But this wasn't the Jason she remembered. He looked pale, his clothes wrinkled and smeared with dirt. Dark circles hung under his eyes, and his hair was disheveled. His eyes, once full of warmth, were wild, desperate, as if he hadn't slept in days. "Jason, what are you doing here?" she stammered, trying to keep her voice steady from potentially freezing from fear. "Vivian, please," Jason whispered, holding up his hands in a plea, his voice shaking. "I'm not here to hurt you. You have to listen to me." But all Vivian could see was the looming danger. In a swift motion, she grabbed the heavy vase from the table and hurled it at him. It smashed into his head with a sickening thud, and Jason crumpled to the ground, clutching his head as blood trickled through his fingers. He groaned in pain, his hand trembling as he tried to push himself up. "Vivian, I'm being controlled. You don't understand." Vivian had already started running toward the door, ready to escape, but his words stopped her. She hesitated, looking back at Jason, who lay slumped on the floor, his voice weaker now, pleading with tears in his eyes. "I don't want to hurt you," he gasped, his face twisted in pain. "It's not me. It's them. They're in my head. There's a bomb, Viv. Please help me." Her heart pounded in her chest, torn between running and the haunting confusion that bothered her. A bomb? What did he mean? Just as she took a step back to him, Michael burst the door open, looking extremely angry. "What the hell are you doing here, you beast?"